ถือว่า
26-year-old woman is dead, and police are looking for her killer. They said the shooting may have happened in front of her own children.
Now, this happened in Montgomery County about 3 o'clock this morning on Torrington Place, just off Salem Avenue. News Center 7's Mike Campbell joins us live with what 911 calls and police are telling him. Mike?
Well, Gabrielle, investigators downtown at the Dayton Police Department headquarters and those here at the West Patrol Operations Division tell me the entire homicide squad is working on this case. Now, you could actually hear shots being fired when one person dialed 911, and it appears the victim herself made a chilling call moments earlier.
At 2:49 a.m., a young mother in Dayton, Ohio, called 911. Her voice was low, steady. Her ex-boyfriend was outside her home, threatening to shoot. Her 2 children were inside. That call, her final call, lasted only seconds. Then came another, a second voice, then silence. When first responders arrived, they found the front door forced open. Inside, Montani Davis was barely clinging to life. Her children were still there, witnesses to the horror that had just unfolded. Montani was 26, a nurse, a mother of 2. Someone who worked through the night caring for others and came home to care for her own. She had fought to keep her family safe from a man who wouldn't let go, even after years apart. And that night, she tried one last time to protect them. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was the final chapter in a history of control and intimidation, a story that ended with Montani lying on her kitchen floor, shot multiple times while her children slept nearby. She had done everything right. She left him. She worked hard. She asked for help. But it wasn't enough. This is the story of Montani Davis. If stories like this matter to you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. At Dark Trace Crime Stories, we speak for those who can't, and your support helps keep their voices alive. Montani Davis lived a quiet, determined life in Dayton, Ohio. She was a 26-year-old mother of 2, a night shift nurse, and someone who chose family over everything else. Her world revolved around her children, and every long shift, every personal sacrifice, pointed back to them. She worked in a local care facility, where she built a reputation for dependability and empathy. Co-workers knew her as someone who didn't cut corners, someone who arrived early and stayed focused. In a job where emotional exhaustion is common, Montani stood out for her steadiness. Even when she was worn down, she showed up. At home, she carried that same energy. Her mother recalled the way Montani would come in from exhausting double shifts, barely speaking, just collapsing onto the couch beside her son. There was rarely time for rest, but always time for reassurance. We're okay, right? That's all that matters. It wasn't just a question. It was her way of keeping everyone grounded. She didn't live loudly. Her faith wasn't performative. It was personal. Something that held her together when things got hard. And things did get hard. Behind her composed exterior was someone managing more than most people realized. She wasn't just working to make ends meet. She was working to keep her family safe. While the world may have seen a nurse clocking in every night, her loved ones saw the full picture. A young woman pushing herself beyond the point of exhaustion to keep things together. Montani didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't share much about her private struggles. But those close to her knew that she was carrying more than just the weight of her job or motherhood. She was also carrying the fear that her past might catch up with her. Even so, she pressed forward, focused, protective, quietly strong. Her life wasn't defined by tragedy. It was defined by effort. Every single day, she tried. For her children, for her future, for the safety and peace she deserved. Montani met Jamar Brown in her early 20s. In the beginning, he came across as gentle, even charming. Like many abusive relationships, it didn't start with violence. It started with attention, constant, flattering, and overwhelming. He wanted to be around her. He checked in often. At first, it may have seemed like devotion, but the tone shifted quickly. What began as attentiveness soon became control. Jamar's calls increased in frequency, 10 to 15 times in a row, even when she didn't respond. If she didn't answer, he'd show up unannounced. He began appearing at her job. No warning, no invitation, just showing up. Montani didn't need to say much for her friends to understand something wasn't right. It wasn't a relationship anymore, it was surveillance. She wasn't being cared for, she was being cornered. Friends noticed the signs, the kind of possessiveness that makes a person shrink into themselves, that pulls them away from others, that turns affection into interrogation. Over time, Jamar's presence in her life wasn't a comfort, it was a looming threat. Montani tried to walk away, more than once, but each time, the pressure followed her, the threats, the persistence, the refusal to accept that she had moved on. This pattern wasn't unique, but it was dangerous. In abusive dynamics, the need for control often outlasts the relationship itself. Even after physical separation, abusers can continue to exert pressure through calls, stalking, intimidation, and fear. For survivors, this creates an ongoing sense of being watched, of being at risk, of never truly being free. For Montani, those years after the breakup were not peaceful. Though the relationship had ended nearly 5 years before her death, the harassment hadn't. The threats were still there. The fear hadn't faded. And Jamar's behavior didn't stop with silence. It escalated. What makes this so tragic is that she tried. She did what survivors are told to do. She left. She focused on her children. She built a new life. But the past wasn't finished with her. Jamar wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was a presence that lingered long after the relationship ended. And Montani, despite her strength, was left to manage that danger on her own. The law wasn't protecting her. His behavior, though deeply threatening, remained just below the threshold of immediate legal action. And like so many in her position, she likely knew the risk of pushing too hard, of making it worse by calling it out. Still, she stood her ground. She worked. She raised her children. She didn't let fear take her voice. But she never got the peace she deserved. Her story reflects what so many survivors face, a system that often expects them to prove danger before it acts, that waits for something to happen before intervening. But by then, it's often too late. Montani wasn't in denial. She understood the risk. She stayed alert. She made the call when the danger reached her front door. But for years, she lived with the constant pressure of knowing that the person she once trusted could still take everything from her. That's the reality of domestic abuse. It doesn't always end when the relationship ends. Sometimes it continues in shadows. Phone calls, unexpected visits, veiled threats. The damage builds slowly, but the end can come in an instant. Montani's experience wasn't an outlier. It's part of a pattern seen in many domestic violence cases, where coercive control turns into obsession, and obsession turns into violence. The line isn't always obvious, but the danger is real. She had tried to reclaim her life. She had separated herself from Jamar, raised her children, and committed to her work. But for her, freedom still came with a cost, constant vigilance, unresolved fear, and ultimately, a night that ended in tragedy. Her relationship with Jamar wasn't just a chapter in her life. It was a battle she fought every day after it ended. One that no one should have to face alone. On the night of April 3, 2024, Montani Davis clocked out from her shift at a local care facility and returned home to Torrington Place in Dayton, Ohio. It was nearly 2 a.m. The neighborhood was quiet, her children were asleep, and her day, like so many before it, was long behind her. She had done what she always did, put in the hours, came home, and got ready to rest before starting again. But the hours that followed would be anything but routine. In the early morning darkness, her phone began to ring. Over and over. The calls came from a number she knew too well. Jamar Brown was outside her home, threatening her once again. This time, his words were more aggressive. He wasn't just calling to harass her. He was threatening to shoot up her house. And he knew her children were inside. At 2:49 a.m., Montani did what so many hope they'll never have to do. She called 911. Her voice was composed, but her message was urgent. She told the dispatcher that her ex-boyfriend was calling her, making threats, and that she feared for her life. She also made it clear her 2 children were in the home with her. She didn't panic. She didn't yell. She simply told the truth. A second 911 call came in minutes later, this time from another adult female believed to be in the home. That call cut off suddenly. Dispatchers were left with little more than silence. What no one knew at that moment was that Jamar wasn't just making threats from a distance. He was already approaching the house. Moments later, he kicked in the front door. Inside, Montani had already gone to bed. She had just finished a night shift. She was exhausted. Her children were nearby. She likely hadn't even processed how close the threat was before the sound of the door crashing open shattered the quiet. What happened next unfolded quickly. There was a confrontation. Words were exchanged. A witness in the home later recalled that Montani's final words were not for herself, but for her children. Please don't hurt my babies. That plea from a mother who had spent her life protecting her kids was the last thing she would say. Jamar shot her multiple times. Then he fled. When first responders arrived, they found Montani gravely wounded. She was rushed to a nearby hospital. But despite the efforts to save her, she was pronounced dead just a few hours later. She was 26 years old. Her children, though physically unharmed, had witnessed an act of violence that would change their lives forever. They lost their mother in the place that was supposed to be safest, their own home. What makes the events of that night even more tragic is how clearly Montani saw the danger. She called for help. She reported the threats. She didn't downplay what was happening. She took every step she could. But it wasn't enough to stop him. The break-in wasn't subtle. The violence wasn't sudden, without context. This was the final act in a long pattern of threats, harassment, and control. A pattern she had tried for years to escape. Law enforcement moved quickly once they identified the suspect. Jamar Brown was located and taken into custody later, that same day. But the damage had already been done. Montani's family lost a daughter. Her children lost their mother. Her co-workers lost a friend they could count on. And her community lost someone who had worked tirelessly, loved deeply, and asked for so little in return. The final hours of Montani Davis's life were marked by exhaustion, duty, and a quiet, desperate effort to keep her children safe. She had just finished caring for others all night. And in her final moments, she was still trying to protect the people she loved most. That is how she should be remembered, not only for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
We are not using the audio that appears to be the 26-year-old victim. She told dispatchers an ex-boyfriend was calling her, threatening to shoot up her house, and she told dispatchers she had 2 children. Then dispatchers received a second call they believe from another adult female that was in the house, but that call dropped.
Hello? 911, we got a call from this number. Is everything okay? Where are you? Where are you?
Police were already on the way after the first call, but more officers headed to the street and the home after the second call.
They found a female, 26 years of age, who had been shot. They did first aid at the scene, but unfortunately she passed away later at the hospital.
Dayton Police Major Brian Johns told us they are following up on some information shared with them in the 911 calls.
There is information that we are aware of, that there was like a break-in there first, that there was like a fight taking place, and then the shots were actually fired, and she was struck and killed.
Police told me their forensic services unit recovered a lot of evidence that they are analyzing. They didn't want to tell me if someone in the home returned fire against the person that broke in or not. They also wouldn't confirm if the victim's children were in the home when the tragedy took place.
I cannot comment yet on that. We do have a person of interest that we're trying to follow up on. Our entire homicide unit right now is out working this complaint, trying to bring some resolution and some justice for the victim and her family.
After Jamar Brown fled the scene in the early hours of April 4th, 2024, law enforcement launched an immediate manhunt. The urgency was clear. A young mother had just been gunned down in her own home, with her children present. The man responsible was on the run, but not for long. By 4:10 p.m. that same day, police located and arrested Jamar. The speed of his apprehension was a result of clear evidence and rapid coordination among officers. But the arrest, while necessary, could not undo what had already happened. At his arraignment in Dayton Municipal Court, Brown faced a sweeping list of charges. That included 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of non-aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, 4 counts of felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. He was denied release and held on $1 million bond. Prosecutors also filed weapons charges, having a firearm under disability, a legal term indicating he was barred from possessing a gun due to prior offenses. These felony charges reflect not only the violence of that night, but the history and planning behind it. The evidence recovered at the scene painted a vivid picture of what had occurred. The front door had been forcibly kicked in, confirming that Jamar had not been let in, but had broken his way into Montani's home. Inside, investigators found a firearm tucked inside a toddler's t-shirt and left behind. That gun would later be linked to the shooting, further tying Jamar to the crime. Witness accounts, forensic findings, and Montani's own 911 call established a chilling but undeniable sequence: a home invasion, a confrontation, and a mother's final attempt to protect her children before her life was taken. The impact of her death spread quickly. News of the shooting shocked her workplace and devastated her family. Candlelight vigils were held in her honor. Social media flooded with tributes. Photos of Montani smiling with her children, posts about her faith, and stories of her selflessness began circulating, not just in Dayton, but beyond. For those who knew her, and even those who didn't, the loss felt personal. Her co-workers described her as the kind of person who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. Her family spoke of her resilience, how she stayed strong through long shifts, and the difficulties she faced behind closed doors. And now, in the aftermath, that same strength was being remembered as a symbol of everything she stood for. Her children survived the attack physically, but everything about their world changed that night. They lost their mother in the most traumatic way imaginable. The place that was meant to be safe was transformed into the site of irreversible loss. In the days following the murder, questions poured in from the community. Could more have been done? Could Montani have been protected? She had made the call. She had voiced the threat. She had taken steps to get away from the danger. But even with all that, help hadn't arrived in time. And that's the part that haunts many, because she did everything right. As the legal process moved forward, attention turned to broader issues: the enforcement of protective measures, the consequences of ignoring ongoing harassment, and how domestic abuse often escalates when it's dismissed as something minor. Montani's story became part of a much larger conversation about prevention, accountability, and the responsibilities of both systems and communities. Jamar Brown now faces a long legal road, but the damage left behind won't be measured in court dates or convictions. It's written in the silence Montani left behind, in the lives of 2 children now growing up without their mother, in the grief of a family who warned, who worried, who watched it unfold. Candle, do you believe enough is being done to protect domestic violence survivors in your community? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters, and it may help someone who's living through something similar right now. The investigation was fast. The arrest was certain. But justice for Montani can never be full. Not when her life ended for simply trying to live in peace. What happened to Montani Davis was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a broader, deeply troubling reality, where domestic abuse doesn't always end with the relationship, and where the presence of a firearm can turn threats into fatalities in seconds. Montani did what many survivors are urged to do. She ended the relationship. She focused on her children, held a steady job, and distanced herself from her ex. But separation doesn't guarantee safety. In fact, for many victims, the period after leaving can be the most dangerous of all. That was Montani's reality. The presence of a gun in domestic abuse situations increases the likelihood of homicide by over 400%. When threats escalate and access to firearms goes unchecked, the risk becomes immediate. In Montani's case, Jamar Brown had not just made verbal threats, he acted on them. And despite her attempt to alert authorities, the window to stop him closed too fast. Too often, violations are treated as low-level offenses or are brushed aside unless accompanied by physical harm. But someone who threatens repeatedly, stalks an ex-partner, or invades their space is signaling a pattern that can escalate. Those early signs must be taken seriously. In Montani's situation, she called 911. She clearly reported the threat. And yet, within minutes, her home was breached and her life was taken. This calls attention to the urgency of improving response protocols, especially when a caller is reporting threats from a former partner. For viewers, it's important to realize that this is not just about one case in Dayton, Ohio. It's about the women, men, and children across the country who live in fear, even after doing everything they're told to do. It's about a broken pattern that repeats itself too often, and the changes needed to interrupt it. Montani Davis was a daughter, a nurse, a mother of two. She was trying to live a peaceful life. But she was also living under pressure, from someone who couldn't let go, from a system that wasn't fast enough, from the weight of staying strong in silence. Her death cannot be undone, but her story must not fade. By acknowledging the patterns, enforcing protections, limiting access to deadly weapons, and standing beside survivors long after they leave, real change is possible. We owe that to Montani. We owe that to every victim who tried to do everything right and still wasn't safe. Montani Davis spent her last breath pleading for her children. Not for herself, but for them. Please don't hurt my babies. That was her final cry. A mother's instinct overpowering fear. Even in the face of death, her only concern was their safety. She died a hero, not because she chose to be, but because she had no choice. She faced violence head-on, alone, at home, in the space that should have been her refuge. And even then, her focus wasn't escape, it was protection. Her death wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was the result of years of intimidation, threats, and a system that didn't act quickly enough. She tried to move forward. She tried to rebuild. She called for help. But none of it was enough to stop the one person who refused to let her live in peace. Montani was more than a victim. She was a mother, a caregiver, a woman who carried more than her share and still smiled through it. Her children, the ones she fought for until the very end, will now grow up without her. They'll grow up remembering her face, her voice, the sound of her laughter, but also the night their world changed forever. Her family will carry a pain no court sentence can undo. Her co-workers will remember the empty space where she used to stand, early to her shift, committed to the people she cared for. But we, as a community, can choose what comes next. We can speak her name. We can tell her story. And we can demand better for the women still living in fear, for the children caught in the middle, and for the futures that don't have to end like this. Montani Davis should still be here. Her children should still have their mother. And her final words should echo not only in grief, but in change. Candle, candle, if you believe more must be done to protect women like Montani, help us raise awareness. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. And most importantly, subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories so we can keep giving voice to victims who deserve to be heard. Every voice we amplify might help save a life.